The psychiatric hospital doors locked behind me as my own family signed papers declaring me mentally incompetent. "She is completely delusional," my brother told the staff. "We fear for our safety," my mother added tearfully. They had convinced a judge that I was a danger to myself and others, also they could seize control of my inheritance. But I had been planning this moment for months, and every word they spoke was being captured by recording devices they never knew existed. What they thought was their victory was actually my carefully orchestrated trap. Before we dive into my story, let me know where you're watching from in the comments below. And if you've experienced family betrayal, hit that like button, you're not alone. My name is Sandra Elizabeth Hartwell, and until 6 months ago, I was living what most people would consider a privileged life in the upscale suburb of Greenwich, Connecticut. At 32 years old, I owned a beautiful colonial house on 3 acres of manicured gardens, drove a Mercedes sedan that I replaced every 2 years, and had access to a $25 million trust fund that my grandmother had established before her death 5 years earlier. But privilege, as I learned the hard way, can become a target when the people closest to you decide they deserve what you have more than you do. My grandmother, Eleanor Hartwell, had been the matriarch of a family that built its fortune through 3 generations of successful real estate development across New England. She owned shopping centers, office buildings, and residential developments that generated millions of dollars in rental income annually. When she died at 87, her will distributed assets among various charities and family members, but the largest single inheritance went to me. The trust fund was structured so that I could access the interest and dividends immediately, but the principal amount would remain untouchable until I turned 35 or got married, whichever came first. The annual income from the investments was substantial, approximately $800,000 per year, which allowed me to live comfortably without working while I pursued my passion for wildlife photography. My family had different ideas about how that money should be managed. My older brother, Marcus Hartwell, was 35 years old and worked as an investment banker in Manhattan. He made excellent money in his own right, but he had also developed expensive tastes that included a penthouse apartment, a house in the Hamptons, and a lifestyle that required constant cash flow to maintain. Marcus had always been the family favorite, the son who followed in our father's footsteps by choosing finance as his career path. Sandra's trust fund is sitting there earning conservative returns when it could be generating much higher yields through proper portfolio management, Marcus had argued during numerous family dinners over the past 2 years. Grandmother was from a different generation that did not understand modern investment strategies. My younger sister, Victoria Hartwell Chen, was 29 years old and married to David Chen, a successful orthodontist. Victoria had always been envious of my financial independence, partly because her own inheritance from grandmother had been significantly smaller. She received a lump sum of $2 million, which she and David had used to purchase their home and establish David's practice. "It is not fair that Sandra gets to live like a trust fund princess while the rest of us work for our money," Victoria complained regularly. "She contributes nothing to society and just travels around taking pictures of animals." My parents, Robert and Catherine Hartwell, were in their early 60s and had been discussing retirement plans that required more capital than their own savings and investments could provide. My father had been a successful attorney, and my mother had worked as a real estate agent, but they had not accumulated the kind of wealth that would allow them to maintain their current lifestyle without additional income. "Your grandmother intended for that money to benefit the entire family, not just one person," my mother often said during our monthly family gatherings. "She would want you to be generous with your siblings and help us all achieve financial security." The pressure to share my inheritance had been building for years, but it intensified significantly after I turned 30 and showed no signs of getting married or changing my lifestyle. My family began making increasingly direct suggestions about how I should be managing the trust fund. "You could loan Marcus the capital he needs for his investment opportunities," my father suggested during Christmas dinner 2 years ago. "The returns would benefit everyone, and you would still maintain ownership of the principal." "Victoria and David could use help expanding his practice," my mother added. "Think of it as an investment in the family's future success." But I had become suspicious of my family's motivations, partly because of conversations I had overheard and partly because of changes in their behavior toward me that felt calculating rather than loving. They had begun asking detailed questions about the trust fund structure, the identity of the trustees, and the legal requirements for accessing the principal amount. That suspicion led me to make a decision that would prove to be the most important choice of my life. I began secretly recording conversations that took place in my house and in my parents' house during family gatherings. The recording equipment was sophisticated but easily concealed. I purchased miniature digital recorders that could be hidden in decorative objects, picture frames, and furniture. Each device could record for up to 72 hours before needing to be retrieved and recharged. I placed them strategically in rooms where family conversations typically took place, ensuring that I would capture any discussions about my financial situation or their plans for my inheritance. What I discovered during 3 months of surveillance was both heartbreaking and terrifying. The first recording that revealed the true nature of their intentions took place in my parents' living room after a family dinner where I had excused myself early, claiming to have a headache. I retrieved the recording device the following week and listened to a conversation that shattered my understanding of my family's love and loyalty. "We cannot wait for Sandra to get married or turn 35, Marcus said, his voice carrying the kind of cold calculation I had never heard from him before. "She is showing no signs of settling down, and we all have financial obligations that cannot wait 3 more years." "What are you suggesting?" my father asked. "I'm suggesting that we explore legal options for gaining control of the trust fund through guardianship or conservatorship," Marcus replied. "If Sandra could be declared mentally incompetent, one of us could be appointed as her guardian with full authority over her financial affairs." My mother's response was even more chilling. "That would require medical evidence of mental illness or cognitive impairment. Sandra has never shown any signs of psychological problems." "Problems can be documented if you know what to look for and how to present them," Victoria interjected. "David has colleagues who specialize in psychiatric evaluations. It would just be a matter of building a case that shows Sandra is unable to make rational financial decisions." The conversation continued for another hour, with my family members discussing specific strategies for having me declared mentally incompetent. They talked about hiring private investigators to document any behavior that could be interpreted as erratic or unstable. They researched the legal requirements for conservatorship proceedings in Connecticut. Most disturbingly, they began planning how to divide my inheritance once they gained control of it. The trust fund would be managed more aggressively, generating higher returns that could benefit all of us, Marcus explained. Sandra would still receive an allowance for her basic needs, but the majority of the income would be available for family investments and expenses. "How much of an allowance?" my father asked. $50,000 per year should be sufficient for someone living in a supervised environment," Victoria suggested. "That is more than generous for someone who cannot manage her own affairs." $50,000 per year from a trust fund that generated $800,000 annually. They were planning to steal 93% of my inheritance while convincing a court that they were acting in my best interests. Over the following weeks, I collected additional recordings that documented their conspiracy in detail. They had researched psychiatric facilities where I could be committed long-term. They had identified attorneys who specialized in conservatorship cases. They had even discussed which family member would be best positioned to serve as my legal guardian. "Marcus should be the primary guardian," my mother decided during one recorded conversation. "He has financial experience and would be most credible to a judge reviewing the arrangement. I could serve as backup guardian in case Marcus has any conflicts of interest," my father added. "The important thing is keeping the decision-making within the family." Victoria's role would be to coordinate with medical professionals and provide testimony about my supposed mental health issues. "I can document incidents of paranoid behavior, mood swings, and poor judgment," she explained. "It will be more convincing coming from a concerned sister than from parents or a brother who might appear to have financial motivations." But the most damning recording was captured during a family meeting at my parents' house where I was not present. They had told me the gathering was cancelled due to my father's work obligations, but I discovered later that they had met without me to finalize their plans. "We need to start creating a documented history of Sandra's mental health problems," Marcus said, reviewing what sounded like written notes. "Subtle changes in behavior that build into a pattern of cognitive decline and poor decision-making." "What kind of changes?" Victoria asked. Increased isolation, paranoid statements about family members, reckless spending, neglect of personal hygiene and home maintenance. Anything that suggests she is losing touch with reality or becoming unable to care for herself. My mother volunteered to start keeping a journal documenting my supposed erratic behavior. I can record concerning phone conversations, incidents of confusion or memory problems, and examples of poor judgment in financial or personal matters. We should also consider having Sandra evaluated by a psychiatrist who understands the legal requirements for competency determinations, my father suggested. It would be helpful to have professional documentation of her condition before initiating formal proceedings. The conversation revealed that they had already researched psychiatrists who could provide the kind of evaluation that would support their case. They had identified Dr. Margaret Thornton, a respected psychiatrist who had testified in numerous conservatorship cases and was known for thorough and credible assessments. Dr. Thornton charges $5,000 for a complete psychological evaluation, Marcus reported. But her reports are highly respected by family court judges, and she has extensive experience with cases involving large financial assets. How do we get Sandra to agree to an evaluation? Victoria asked. We present it as a family intervention motivated by love and concern, my mother replied. She has been isolated and moody lately. We are worried about her well-being and think professional guidance would be beneficial. As I listened to these recordings, I realized that my family had been planning my psychological imprisonment for months. Every interaction we had shared recently had been part of their strategy to build a case for my mental incompetence. The concerns they expressed about my lifestyle, the suggestions they made about my social life, the questions they asked about my daily routines were all designed to gather information they could use against me. But they had made one critical mistake. They assumed that I was naive enough to trust them completely and oblivious enough to miss the signs of their betrayal. In reality, I had been suspicious of their motivations for over a year. My background in wildlife photography had taught me to be observant, patient, and strategic in my approach to complex situations. The skills I used to track and document animal behavior in their natural habitats proved to be equally useful for tracking and documenting human behavior in domestic environments. Once I understood the scope of their conspiracy, I began developing my own strategy for turning their plan against them. If they wanted to declare me mentally incompetent, I would give them exactly the kind of behavior they were looking for. But I would also ensure that their conspiracy was documented in ways that would expose them when the right moment arrived. The plan I developed was both simple and sophisticated. I would appear to develop the exact symptoms they were hoping to document, while secretly recording their responses and building a comprehensive case that would prove their conspiracy to commit fraud and abuse. The first phase involved gradually changing my behavior in ways that would seem concerning to people looking for signs of mental illness, while being careful not to do anything that would actually harm my health or safety. I began cancelling social plans at the last minute, claiming that I felt anxious about leaving my house. I started expressing vague worries about people following me or monitoring my activities. I complained about having trouble sleeping and difficulty concentrating on simple tasks. My family's response to these changes was immediate and revealing. Instead of expressing genuine concern for my well-being, they began documenting every incident with the kind of clinical detail that suggested they were building a legal case. Sandra called 3 times yesterday asking if we had talked to her neighbors about her. My mother recorded in a voice memo I later discovered. She seems to believe that people are discussing her private business, which could indicate developing paranoid delusions. Marcus started taking photographs of my house whenever he visited, focusing on areas that showed minor maintenance issues or clutter that could be interpreted as neglect. Property upkeep has declined noticeably over the past month, he wrote in emails to other family members that I later accessed through his computer. Lawn care irregular, mail accumulating, general appearance of disorganization. Victoria began asking leading questions during our phone conversations, trying to get me to say things that could be used as evidence of confusion or poor judgment. Sandra, did you remember to pay your utility bills this month? She would ask. I worry that you might be having trouble keeping track of your responsibilities. Each family member was playing their assigned role in what they believed was a careful strategy to document my mental decline. But what they did not realize was that I was documenting their strategy with the same level of detail they were using to document my behavior. The recording devices I had placed in their homes and offices captured conversations where they discussed their progress in building a case against me, celebrated minor victories when I exhibited behavior they could use as evidence, and planned the next phases of their operation. "Sandra's paranoia is getting worse," Victoria reported during one family conference call I recorded. "Yesterday she asked me if I thought our neighbors were watching her house. She seemed genuinely frightened, which is perfect for our case." "I have been documenting her financial irregularities," Marcus added. "She has been making unusual purchases and seems confused about her bank balances. Dr. Thornton will be very interested in these patterns. The important thing is to be consistent in our documentation," my father reminded them. "Every family member needs to be recording the same types of concerning behaviors so our testimony will be corroborated." After 3 months of this elaborate performance, my family felt confident enough to schedule the psychiatric evaluation they had been planning. Dr. Thornton agreed to conduct a comprehensive assessment that would include psychological testing, interviews with family members, and a review of the documentation they had been collecting. "Sandra, we have arranged for you to meet with Dr. Thornton next week," my mother announced during a family dinner that I attended specifically because I knew they would use the occasion to spring their trap. "We are all concerned about some changes we have noticed in your behavior lately, and we think professional guidance would be helpful." "What kind of changes?" I asked, playing my role as someone who was genuinely confused by their concerns. "You have been isolating yourself, expressing paranoid thoughts, and showing signs of difficulty managing your daily responsibilities," Marcus explained with the kind of false concern that made my skin crawl. "We love you and want to make sure you get the help you need." The appointment with Dr. Thornton was scheduled for the following Thursday at 2:00 in the afternoon. I had exactly 1 week to prepare for the most important performance of my life, knowing that my family's conspiracy would soon reach its climax. But I was ready for them. Because while they had been planning my psychological imprisonment, I had been planning their legal destruction. And unlike their plan, mine was based on truth rather than lies, evidence rather than manipulation, and justice rather than greed. The recordings I had collected over the past 6 months contained enough evidence to send all 4 of them to prison for conspiracy, fraud, and elder abuse. But first, I had to allow them to believe they had succeeded in having me declared mentally incompetent. Because the most satisfying revenge against people who underestimate your intelligence is proving that they never understood who they were dealing with in the first place. During the week leading up to my appointment with Dr. Thornton, I received an unexpected ally in the form of my grandmother's former housekeeper, Maria Santos. Maria had worked for Eleanor Hartwell for over 20 years and had remained close to me after my grandmother's death. She was 63 years old, originally from El Salvador, and possessed the kind of practical wisdom that comes from observing wealthy families for decades. "Miss Sandra, I am worried about your family," Maria said during one of her weekly visits to help maintain my house and gardens. "Your grandmother, she always said you were the only one who had her heart, not just her money." Maria had noticed changes in my family's behavior that even I had missed. During her years working for my grandmother, she had developed an ability to read the subtle dynamics of family relationships and identify when people's motivations were not what they appeared to be. "Your brother Marcus, he came to your grandmother's house 3 times in the month before she died," Maria revealed as we sat in my kitchen drinking coffee. "He never visited when she was alive and healthy, but suddenly he was very interested in her legal papers and where she kept important documents." This was information I had never known. Marcus had always claimed that he had been too busy with work to visit grandmother regularly, and that his presence during her final illness showed how much he cared about family. What did he want to know about her papers? I asked. He asked me if I knew where she kept her will, her bank account information, and her lawyer's contact details. He said he was trying to help organize her affairs so the family would be prepared when the time came. Maria had found Marcus's interest suspicious because my grandmother had been very private about her financial matters and had specifically instructed Maria never to discuss her business with family members. Your grandmother told me that money changes people and that even family cannot always be trusted when large amounts of money are involved, Maria explained. She made me promise that if anyone in the family ever asked me about her private affairs, I should tell them to speak directly with her attorney. But the most disturbing information Maria shared involved conversations she had overheard between my mother and Victoria during the weeks following my grandmother's funeral. They came to the house to collect some of her personal items, Maria said. I was cleaning upstairs when I heard them talking in the living room. Your mother said that $25 million was too much money for one person to control, especially someone as young and irresponsible as you. According to Maria, Victoria had agreed enthusiastically, adding that my lifestyle of traveling and taking photographs was proof that I did not understand the value of money or the importance of family obligations. Your sister said that your grandmother had made a mistake in the will and that the family needed to find a way to correct that mistake, Maria continued. She said you would be happier without the stress of managing such a large inheritance. These conversations had taken place over 2 years ago, which meant that my family's conspiracy had been developing much longer than I had realized. They had been planning to gain control of my inheritance almost from the moment my grandmother's will was read. Maria also provided crucial information about my family's recent activities that I had been unable to monitor through my recording devices. Your brother has been meeting with lawyers downtown, she reported. I know this because my nephew Carlos works as a janitor in one of the law office buildings, and he has seen Marcus there several times in the evening when the regular business hours are over. Late evening meetings with attorneys suggested that Marcus was seeking legal advice that he wanted to keep confidential, possibly consulting specialists in conservatorship law who could advise him on the most effective strategies for having me declared incompetent. Maria, I need you to know that my family is planning to have me committed to a psychiatric hospital so they can take control of my trust fund, I said, deciding that I needed at least one person outside the conspiracy who understood what was happening. Maria's reaction was immediate and fierce. Those bastards, she said in Spanish, then quickly apologized for her language. Miss Sandra, your grandmother would be rolling in her grave if she knew what they were planning. I have been recording their conversations for months, I continued. I have evidence of their conspiracy, but I need to let them proceed with their plan so I can prove their intentions in court. Maria nodded with understanding. You are like your grandmother. She was always thinking 3 steps ahead of everyone else. Will you help me? I asked. Whatever you need, Maria replied without hesitation. I explained to Maria that I would need someone to maintain my house and monitor my affairs while I was committed to the psychiatric facility. More importantly, I needed someone I could trust to safeguard the evidence I had collected and ensure that it reached the proper authorities when the time was right. I have copies of all the recordings hidden in 3 different locations, I told her. If something happens to me, or if my family tries to have me permanently committed, you will need to contact my attorney and provide him with access to this evidence. Maria agreed to serve as my insurance policy against the possibility that my family's conspiracy might succeed beyond my ability to expose it. The day of my appointment with Dr. Thornton arrived with unseasonably cold weather that seemed to match the gravity of what I was about to undertake. I dressed carefully in clothes that were slightly wrinkled and mismatched, creating the impression of someone who was struggling with basic self-care without appearing obviously disheveled. My family arrived at Dr. Thornton's office 30 minutes before my scheduled appointment, ostensibly to provide background information that would help with my evaluation. I knew they were actually coordinating their testimony to ensure that their stories about my mental health problems would be consistent and convincing. Dr. Margaret Thornton was exactly what I had expected from my family's descriptions. She was a woman in her late 50s with graying hair pulled back in a conservative bun, wearing a tailored suit that suggested both professionalism and authority. Her office was decorated with diplomas, professional awards, and medical journals that established her credentials as an expert in psychiatric evaluation. Sandra, your family is concerned about some changes they have noticed in your behavior over the past few months. Dr. Thornton began, consulting notes that my family had obviously provided in advance. They asked me to conduct a comprehensive evaluation to determine whether you might benefit from professional treatment. I do not think there is anything wrong with me, I replied, playing the role of someone who was genuinely confused by her family's concerns while exhibiting subtle signs of the paranoia they had been documenting. Sometimes people who are experiencing psychological difficulties are not aware of the changes others can see, Dr. Thornton explained gently. That is why it can be helpful to have family members involved in the evaluation process. The evaluation continued for 3 hours and included psychological testing, memory assessments, and detailed questions about my daily routines, social relationships, and financial management. I answered each question carefully, providing responses that would support my family's claims about my mental state without being so obviously fabricated that Dr. Thornton would become suspicious. When asked about my relationships with family members, I expressed vague concerns that they might be talking about me behind my back or making decisions about my life without consulting me. These statements would be interpreted as paranoid delusions, but they were actually accurate descriptions of exactly what my family had been doing for months. Do you ever feel that people are watching you or monitoring your activities? Dr. Thornton asked. Sometimes I think my family is keeping track of what I do, I replied honestly. I feel like they know things about my daily routine that I never told them. Dr. Thornton made extensive notes about my response, obviously viewing my accurate perception of my family's surveillance as evidence of paranoid thinking. The financial management portion of the evaluation was particularly important because my family's ultimate goal was to gain control of my trust fund. Dr. Thornton asked detailed questions about my spending habits, investment decisions, and ability to manage money responsibly. I have been having trouble keeping track of my expenses lately, I told her, which was completely false but aligned with the financial irregularities Marcus claimed to have documented. Sometimes I forget whether I have paid bills or not. Have you made any unusually large or impulsive purchases recently? Dr. Thornton inquired. I bought some expensive camera equipment last month, but then I could not remember why I needed it, I replied, referring to a legitimate purchase I had made for my photography work but presenting it as evidence of poor judgment. By the end of the evaluation, I was confident that I had provided exactly the kind of responses my family hoped I would give. Dr. Thornton had gathered substantial evidence that could be used to support claims that I was experiencing cognitive decline, paranoid delusions, and impaired financial judgment. Sandra, I want you to know that seeking help is a sign of strength, not weakness, Dr. Thornton said as our session concluded. Based on what I have observed today, I think you would benefit from additional evaluation in a controlled environment where we can monitor your symptoms more closely. What kind of controlled environment? I asked, though I already knew the answer. I am recommending temporary commitment to Riverside Psychiatric Hospital for a comprehensive assessment period, Dr. Thornton explained. This will allow us to observe your behavior over several days and determine the most appropriate treatment plan. The recommendation was exactly what my family had been hoping for. Within 48 hours, they had petitioned the family court for emergency guardianship based on Dr. Thornton's evaluation, and I was committed to Riverside Psychiatric Hospital for an indefinite period of observation and treatment. As the hospital intake staff processed my admission paperwork and my family signed the legal documents that gave them temporary control over my affairs, I felt a mixture of satisfaction and apprehension. My plan was working perfectly, but I was also about to enter a psychiatric facility where I would be completely at the mercy of people who believed I was mentally ill. But I had prepared for this moment for months, and I was ready to play the most challenging role of my life. Because while my family celebrated their victory in gaining control of my inheritance, I was gathering the final pieces of evidence that would expose their conspiracy and send them all to prison. Riverside Psychiatric Hospital was a sprawling complex of brick buildings surrounded by manicured lawns that gave it the appearance of an exclusive boarding school rather than a mental health facility. The illusion of tranquility ended the moment the intake staff processed my admission and I was escorted to Ward 7, the section designated for patients requiring extended evaluation and observation. My room was sparse but comfortable, with a single bed, a small desk, and a window that overlooked the hospital's garden courtyard. The door could not be locked from the inside, and staff members conducted wellness checks every 4 hours around the clock. I was assigned to Dr. James Harrison, the facility's chief psychiatrist, who would oversee my treatment and determine when I might be ready for release. Dr. Harrison was a man in his early 40s with kind eyes and a gentle manner that immediately put patients at ease. During our first session, he reviewed Dr. Thornton's evaluation and the documentation my family had provided about my supposed mental health decline. "Sandra, I want you to know that you are here because people who care about you are concerned for your well-being," Dr. Harrison said, clearly believing that my family's motivations were genuine. "Our goal is to help you understand what you are experiencing and develop strategies for managing any symptoms that might be affecting your daily life." "I do not think I need to be here," I replied, maintaining the role of someone who was confused about her circumstances but not openly hostile to treatment. "My family seems to think I have problems that I do not recognize in myself." "That is not uncommon," Dr. Harrison explained. "Many people who are dealing with mental health challenges have difficulty seeing changes that are obvious to others. That is why family input is so valuable in developing effective treatment plans." Over the following days, I was introduced to the hospital's daily routine, which included group therapy sessions, individual counseling appointments, recreational activities, and structured meal times. My fellow patients represented a diverse range of mental health conditions, from severe depression and anxiety disorders to more complex psychological conditions that required intensive treatment. The group therapy sessions were led by Dr. Patricia Williams, a psychologist in her 30s who specialized in family dynamics and relationship counseling. During these sessions, I learned about the experiences of other patients whose families had been involved in their commitment to the facility. "My husband had me committed because he said I was spending too much money on things we did not need," shared Margaret, a woman in her 50s who had been at Riverside for 3 months. "He took control of our bank accounts and told the doctors that I was having manic episodes that made me irresponsible with finances." Margaret's story was remarkably similar to my own situation, except that she genuinely seemed to be struggling with mood disorders that affected her judgment about money and relationships. Her husband appeared to be acting out of legitimate concern rather than financial self-interest. Another patient, Robert, had been committed by his adult children who claimed he was becoming increasingly paranoid and unable to care for himself properly. "They said I was imagining that people were trying to break into my house," Robert explained during one group session. "But after I got here, my neighbor called to tell me that someone actually had been breaking into houses in our neighborhood." Robert's case was particularly interesting because it suggested that sometimes what appears to be paranoid behavior might actually be accurate perception of real threats. His children had interpreted his security concerns as evidence of mental illness, when in fact he had been responding appropriately to genuine danger. These stories reinforced my understanding that the line between legitimate mental health treatment and family manipulation could be extremely thin, especially when significant financial assets were involved. During my second week at Riverside, my family began making regular visits that were ostensibly motivated by love and concern, but were actually opportunities for them to monitor my condition and ensure that I was exhibiting the symptoms they needed to maintain their guardianship. Marcus typically visited on Tuesday afternoons, bringing magazines and books that he thought might help with my recovery. During these visits, he would ask leading questions designed to assess whether my supposed mental health problems were improving or getting worse. "How are you feeling about your treatment, Sandra?" he would ask. "Are you starting to understand why we were concerned about your behavior?" "I am still confused about why everyone thinks I need to be here," I would reply, which was exactly the kind of response that suggested I was still in denial about my mental health problems. Marcus would then report these conversations to Dr. Harrison, providing updates on my progress that were designed to extend my commitment rather than facilitate my release. Victoria visited on Thursday evenings, usually bringing items from my house that she claimed I had requested but that I had never asked for. These visits gave her opportunities to search through my personal belongings under the guise of being helpful, while also documenting my living conditions as evidence that I was unable to maintain my home properly. "I brought some of your clothes from home," Victoria would say, presenting items that were deliberately wrinkled or stained to support their claims about my declining self-care abilities. "Your house is getting pretty messy, Sandra. I think you were having trouble keeping up with cleaning and organizing." My parents visited together on Saturday mornings, bringing updates about family news and expressing hope that I would soon be ready to return home under their continued supervision. These visits were particularly difficult because they combined genuine expressions of affection with subtle manipulations designed to reinforce my dependence on their guidance. "We want you to know that we will always be here to help you manage whatever challenges you are facing," my mother would say, holding my hand and speaking with apparent sincerity. "Once you are ready to leave the hospital, we can arrange for you to live somewhere with more support and supervision." What kind of support and supervision? I would ask. Maybe a nice assisted living facility where trained staff can help you with daily routines and medication management, my father would suggest. Somewhere you would not have to worry about the stress of managing your finances or making complicated decisions. These conversations revealed that my family's long-term plan involved not just controlling my inheritance, but also ensuring that I remained permanently under their supervision in a way that would prevent me from ever challenging their authority or regaining control of my own life. But while my family was focused on maintaining the illusion that they were acting in my best interests, I was using my time at Riverside to gather additional evidence of their conspiracy and develop relationships that would be crucial for my eventual escape from their trap. The most important relationship I developed was with Janet Morrison, a social worker in her 40s who had worked at Riverside for over 15 years. Janet was responsible for coordinating with patients' families and monitoring the progress of guardianship arrangements, which meant she had extensive experience recognizing when family members might be taking advantage of vulnerable patients. "Sandra, I have been reviewing your case file and your family's documentation," Janet said during one of our weekly meetings. "Some of the behaviors they described seem inconsistent with what I have observed during your time here." "What do you mean?" I asked, though I was hopeful that Janet's professional experience had allowed her to see through my family's deception. "Your family claims that you were exhibiting paranoid delusions about people monitoring your activities," Janet explained. "But during your stay here, you have never expressed unrealistic concerns about surveillance or shown signs of paranoid thinking." Janet had also noticed discrepancies between my family's descriptions of my financial management problems and my actual ability to discuss money matters rationally and coherently. "They say you are having trouble keeping track of your expenses and making impulsive purchases," she continued. "But when we discuss your financial situation, you demonstrate clear understanding of budgeting, investments, and long-term financial planning." These observations gave me an opportunity to begin carefully revealing the truth about my situation to someone who had the professional expertise to recognize family manipulation when she saw it. "Janet, what would you think if I told you that some of my family members have been having private meetings with attorneys about gaining permanent control of my inheritance?" I asked. "I would think that sounds like information you should discuss with your own attorney," Janet replied immediately. "Patients have the right to independent legal representation, especially in cases involving large financial assets." "My family told me that I do not need my own attorney because they are looking out for my interests," I said. Janet's expression hardened. "Sandra, that is exactly the kind of statement that raises red flags about potential financial abuse. Every patient has the right to legal counsel, regardless of what their family members might prefer." With Janet's help, I was able to contact attorney Michael Stevens, who specialized in cases involving financial abuse of vulnerable adults. Attorney Stevens agreed to visit me at Riverside to discuss my legal rights and review the evidence I had been collecting about my family's conspiracy. Ms. Hartwell, what you have described sounds like a textbook case of conservatorship abuse, Attorney Stevens said during our confidential meeting in the hospital's legal consultation room. "If you have recordings that document your family's conspiracy to have you declared incompetent for financial gain, those recordings could be grounds for criminal charges as well as civil lawsuits. The recordings are hidden in secure locations that only I and one trusted friend can access," I explained. "I need to be released from this facility before I can provide them to you." "That creates a complex legal situation," Attorney Stevens replied. "Your family currently has legal guardianship over you, which means they have the authority to make decisions about your treatment and release. Challenging that guardianship will require proving that it was obtained through fraudulent means." Attorney Stevens explained that exposing my family's conspiracy would require a carefully coordinated legal strategy that involved both criminal and civil proceedings. The criminal case would focus on charges of conspiracy, fraud, and elder abuse. The civil case would seek to invalidate the guardianship and recover any assets my family had illegally accessed. How long do you think this process will take? I asked. If your evidence is as comprehensive as you have described, we could potentially resolve the criminal case within 6 months, Attorney Stevens replied. The civil proceedings might take longer, but the important thing is regaining your legal independence and protecting your assets from further abuse. During my 4th month at Riverside, I learned that my family's management of my inheritance was even more aggressive than I had anticipated. Maria Santos visited me during designated visiting hours to provide updates on activities at my house and in the community. Miss Sandra, your brother has been meeting with investment advisors about moving your trust fund assets into higher-risk investments, Maria reported. My nephew Carlos heard him talking on the phone about doubling the returns within 2 years. This information was particularly alarming because the trust fund had been structured with conservative investments specifically to preserve the principal amount while generating steady income. Moving the assets into high-risk investments could result in significant losses that would reduce my inheritance permanently. Maria, I need you to contact Attorney Stevens immediately and tell him that my family is actively transferring my assets, I said. This gives us grounds for emergency legal intervention to prevent further financial damage. Maria also brought disturbing news about my house and personal property. Your sister has been taking things from your house and telling people that you asked her to donate them to charity, she revealed. Last week, she took your grandmother's jewelry collection and your photography equipment. The theft of my grandmother's jewelry was particularly significant because those items had substantial sentimental and financial value that was separate from the trust fund. My family was systematically looting my personal property while I was confined to the psychiatric facility. But Maria brought me one piece of information that would prove to be the key to accelerating my legal strategy. Miss Sandra, I found something interesting while cleaning your parents' house last week, she said, pulling a small digital recorder from her purse. I recorded a conversation between your parents and your brother where they talked about keeping you in the hospital permanently. The recording Maria had made captured my family discussing their long-term plans for maintaining control over my inheritance by ensuring that I never regained legal competence. Sandra is doing better than we hoped she would, my mother's voice said on the recording. If she continues to improve, the doctors might recommend her release, which would complicate our guardianship arrangement. Marcus's response revealed the true depth of their conspiracy. Dr. Harrison mentioned that Sandra's prognosis is good and that she might be ready for supervised release within the next few months. We need to find ways to document setbacks in her condition that would justify extending her commitment. What kind of setbacks? My father asked. Incidents of agitation, refusal to cooperate with treatment, expressions of paranoid thoughts about family members, Victoria suggested. Things that would convince the medical staff that she is not ready for independent living. The recording continued with my family planning specific strategies for sabotaging my recovery progress by creating incidents that would be interpreted as evidence of ongoing mental illness. If Sandra starts talking about wanting to manage her own finances again, we can present that as unrealistic thinking that shows she is not ready for independence, Marcus explained. We should also document any criticism she makes of our guardianship as evidence of paranoid thinking, my mother added. This recording provided the smoking gun that Attorney Stevens needed to prove that my family's guardianship was based on fraudulent representations and that they were actively working to maintain my confinement for their own financial benefit. Maria, this recording changes everything, I told her. Attorney Stevens can use this as evidence to petition for my immediate release and the invalidation of my family's guardianship. Miss Sandra, there is one more thing you need to know, Maria said. Your brother has been telling people in the community that you have been diagnosed with early-onset dementia and that your condition is expected to get worse over time. This lie was particularly damaging because it suggested that my mental health problems were progressive and irreversible, which would justify permanent guardianship and long-term institutional care. But it was also the final piece of evidence I needed to demonstrate that my family's conspiracy was not just about temporary financial gain, but about permanently destroying my independence and autonomy for their own benefit. After 5 months at Riverside Psychiatric Hospital, I had gathered enough evidence to expose my family's conspiracy and win my freedom. But I had also learned valuable lessons about the vulnerability of people who trust their families to act in their best interests, and the ease with which the mental health system can be manipulated by people with financial motivations. The time had come to spring my trap and show my family that the woman they thought they had outsmarted was actually the one who had been controlling the game from the very beginning. Attorney Stevens filed an emergency motion with the family court on a Monday morning in November, exactly 6 months after my admission to Riverside Psychiatric Hospital. The motion requested an immediate hearing to review my guardianship based on new evidence of fraud and conspiracy. Judge Patricia Morrison, who had originally approved my family's guardianship petition, scheduled the hearing for the following Friday. My family's reaction to the legal challenge was immediate and predictable. Marcus called Attorney Stevens' office within hours of receiving the court notification, demanding to know who had hired an attorney to represent me and how I had managed to coordinate legal action from inside a psychiatric facility. Ms. Hartwell has the constitutional right to legal representation, Attorney Stevens informed Marcus during a phone conversation that I later learned had been recorded. Your guardianship does not eliminate her fundamental legal rights, including the right to challenge the guardianship itself. Sandra is mentally incompetent, Marcus replied, his voice rising with anger that revealed how threatened he felt by the unexpected legal challenge. She is not capable of making rational decisions about her legal representation or her financial affairs. That determination will be reviewed by the court based on current evidence rather than 6-month-old evaluations, Attorney Stevens responded calmly. I suggest you retain legal counsel to represent your interests in this matter. The days leading up to the court hearing were filled with frantic activity as both sides prepared their cases. My family hired Jonathan Pierce, an attorney who specialized in defending guardianship arrangements and had extensive experience with cases involving large financial assets. Attorney Pierce immediately petitioned the court to prevent me from attending the hearing in person, arguing that my mental state made it inadvisable for me to be exposed to the stress of legal proceedings. He also requested that all evidence be reviewed in closed session to protect my privacy and prevent further psychological damage. But Judge Morrison denied both requests after reviewing Attorney Stevens' preliminary evidence about the nature of my family's conspiracy. This court will not prevent Ms. Hartwell from participating in proceedings that directly affect her fundamental rights, Judge Morrison ruled. Furthermore, if there is evidence of fraud or conspiracy in the original guardianship petition, those matters require full transparency rather than closed proceedings. On the morning of the hearing, Maria Santos arrived at Riverside Psychiatric Hospital with clothes I had specifically requested for my court appearance. Instead of the institutional clothing or casual wear I had been wearing for 6 months, I dressed in a tailored business suit that projected competence and professional credibility. The transformation was immediately noticed by hospital staff who had become accustomed to seeing me as a psychiatric patient rather than a successful adult woman. Dr. Harrison commented that my appearance and demeanor seemed remarkably different from the confused and fragmented person who had been admitted 6 months earlier. Sandra, you seem much more confident and articulate today, Dr. Harrison observed as hospital security prepared to transport me to the courthouse. I'm curious to see how you handle the stress of these legal proceedings. The courthouse was packed with family members, attorneys, court officials, and spectators who had been drawn by news reports about the unusual guardianship challenge. My parents, Marcus and Victoria, sat in the front row behind Attorney Pierce, presenting a unified front of concerned family members who were being unfairly attacked by baseless legal accusations. But their confident facade cracked the moment I entered the courtroom wearing my business suit and walking with the kind of self-assured bearing that contradicted everything they had claimed about my mental incompetence. Judge Morrison called the hearing to order and outlined the issues that would be addressed. This court will review evidence regarding the original guardianship petition, the current mental capacity of Ms. Sandra Hartwell, and allegations of fraud or conspiracy in the establishment of the guardianship arrangement. Attorney Stevens began by playing selected portions of the recordings I had made over the past 8 months. The first recording was from a family meeting where Marcus, Victoria, and my parents discussed their strategy for having me declared mentally incompetent. We need to start creating a documented history of Sandra's mental health problems, Marcus's voice filled the courtroom through high-quality speakers. Subtle changes in behavior that build into a pattern of cognitive decline and poor decision-making. The reaction from my family was immediate and devastating. Victoria's face went pale as she heard her own voice suggesting specific symptoms I should be documented as exhibiting. My mother's hands began trembling as she listened to herself volunteering to keep a journal of my supposed erratic behavior. But the most damaging recording was the one Maria had captured just 2 weeks earlier, where my family discussed their plans for keeping me permanently hospitalized to maintain control over my inheritance. "Sandra is doing better than we hoped she would," my mother's voice played through the courthouse speakers. "If she continues to improve, the doctors might recommend her release, which would complicate our guardianship arrangement." Marcus's response echoed through the silent courtroom. "We need to find ways to document setbacks in her condition that would justify extending her commitment." The recordings continued for over an hour, revealing the full scope of my family's conspiracy in their own words. Their discussions about hiring specific psychiatrists, their strategies for manipulating my behavior evaluations, and their plans for dividing my inheritance once they gained permanent control. When the recordings ended, Judge Morrison looked directly at my family with an expression of disgust that was shared by everyone else in the courtroom. "Mr. Pierce, do your clients have any explanation for these recorded conversations?" Judge Morrison asked. Attorney Pierce requested a brief recess to consult with his clients, but when the hearing resumed, he could only offer weak arguments that the recordings had been taken out of context and did not accurately represent his client's motivations. "Your Honor, families often discuss concerns about loved ones in ways that might sound calculating when removed from their emotional context," Pierce argued. "My clients were genuinely worried about Ms. Hartwell's mental health and were exploring legal options to ensure she received appropriate care." But Attorney Stevens had additional evidence that demolished any claim that my family had been acting in good faith. "Your Honor, I would like to present financial records showing how the defendants have managed Ms. Hartwell's assets during the 6 months of their guardianship," Attorney Stevens announced. The financial documentation revealed that my family had transferred over $8 million from conservative investments into high-risk ventures that had already resulted in significant losses. They had also liquidated valuable assets, including my grandmother's jewelry collection and artwork, converting them to cash that was deposited in accounts controlled by Marcus. These financial transactions were conducted without court approval and without consideration of Ms. Hartwell's documented investment preferences, Attorney Stevens explained. "The defendants have treated her inheritance as their personal investment fund rather than assets they were entrusted to protect." But the most shocking revelation came when Attorney Stevens presented documentation showing that my family had already spent over $300,000 of my money on personal expenses, including Marcus's credit card debts, Victoria's home renovation project, and my parents' luxury vacation to Europe. "Your Honor, the defendants have systematically looted Ms. Hartwell's inheritance while she was confined to a psychiatric facility based on their fraudulent claims about her mental capacity," Attorney Stevens declared. Judge Morrison called for another recess to review the financial evidence, and when she returned, her anger was evident to everyone in the courtroom. "This court finds that the original guardianship petition was based on fraudulent representations and that the guardians have violated their fiduciary duties in the most egregious manner possible," Judge Morrison announced. "The guardianship is hereby terminated immediately, and all assets are ordered to be returned to Ms. Hartwell's control within 48 hours. But Judge Morrison was not finished. Furthermore, this court is referring this matter to the District Attorney's Office for investigation of potential criminal charges including conspiracy, fraud, elder abuse, and theft." The courtroom erupted as my family realized that their carefully planned conspiracy had not only failed but had also exposed them to serious criminal liability. Victoria began crying openly, my mother appeared to be in shock, and Marcus was frantically whispering instructions to Attorney Pierce about damage control strategies. As court officials removed the legal constraints that had kept me hospitalized for 6 months, I stood up and walked to where my family was sitting in stunned silence. "Marcus, Victoria, Mom, Dad," I said, my voice carrying clearly through the silent courtroom. "You spent months planning to steal my inheritance by convincing everyone that I was mentally incompetent. But the truth is that you never understood who you were dealing with. I paused to let the full impact of my words settle over them. Every conversation you had about your conspiracy was recorded. Every lie you told about my mental health was documented. Every dollar you stole was tracked. You thought you were outsmarting a confused and vulnerable woman, but you were actually providing evidence for your own prosecution. The look of realization on their faces was worth every day I had spent in that psychiatric hospital. They finally understood that I had been in control of the situation from the very beginning, and that their greed had led them directly into a trap of their own making. 3 weeks after the court hearing, the district attorney filed criminal charges against all 4 family members. Marcus was charged with conspiracy, fraud, and grand theft. Victoria faced charges of conspiracy and theft of personal property. My parents were charged as accessories to fraud and conspiracy. The criminal trial lasted 6 months and resulted in convictions for all 4 defendants. Marcus was sentenced to 5 years in prison and ordered to pay full restitution for the financial losses he had caused. Victoria received 3 years in prison and was ordered to return all personal property she had stolen from my house. My parents were sentenced to 2 years of probation and community service, with the understanding that any further contact with me would result in immediate incarceration. But the legal victories were only part of my revenge against the family that had betrayed me so completely. The civil lawsuit I filed resulted in a judgment that awarded me not only the return of all stolen assets, but also punitive damages totaling $12 million. The judgment included my parents' house, Marcus's investments, and Victoria's savings, effectively destroying the financial security they had hoped to gain by stealing my inheritance. More satisfying than the financial penalties was the public exposure of their conspiracy. News coverage of the trial revealed the details of their plot to the entire Greenwich community, destroying their reputations and social standing permanently. Marcus lost his position at the investment bank when his criminal conviction became public knowledge. Victoria's marriage to David ended when he learned about her role in the conspiracy and her criminal conviction. My parents were forced to sell their house to pay legal fees and were essentially ostracized by their former friends and social circle. But perhaps the most fitting punishment was that their conspiracy had actually made me wealthier than I would have been otherwise. The punitive damages from the civil lawsuit, combined with the return of my original inheritance and 6 months of accumulated interest, left me with a net worth of over $37 million. 6 months after the criminal trial ended, I received an unexpected visitor at my Greenwich home, which I had reclaimed and restored to its original condition. Maria Santos had continued working as my housekeeper, but she had also become one of my closest friends and most trusted advisors. "Miss Sandra, there is someone here to see you," Maria announced, showing Dr. Harrison into my living room. Dr. Harrison looked around the beautifully appointed room with obvious surprise. "Sandra, I wanted to apologize for my role in your confinement at Riverside," he said. "I genuinely believed that your family was acting in your best interests, and I failed to recognize the signs of their deception." "Dr. Harrison, you were not the only person they fooled," I replied. "Their conspiracy was sophisticated and convincing, and they had been planning it for years. Still, I should have been more skeptical of their claims and more attentive to inconsistencies in their documentation," Dr. Harrison insisted. "Your case has taught me to be much more careful about family dynamics in guardianship situations." Dr. Harrison had actually become an advocate for patients' rights following my case, working to develop new protocols for detecting family manipulation and financial abuse in psychiatric settings. "I have been following your recovery since your release," Dr. Harrison continued. "You seem to have made a remarkable adjustment to your freedom." "I was never actually ill, Dr. Harrison," I reminded him. "I was just playing a role that allowed my family to reveal their true intentions." "That level of self-control and strategic thinking is extraordinary," Dr. Harrison replied. "Most people could not have maintained such a deception under the stress of psychiatric hospitalization." As Dr. Harrison prepared to leave, he asked a question that had obviously been troubling him since learning the truth about my case. "Sandra, do you ever regret the lengths you went to expose your family's conspiracy? Some people might argue that you could have handled the situation through less dramatic means." I considered his question carefully before responding. Dr. Harrison, my family was not going to be deterred by conversations or appeals to their conscience. They had already demonstrated their willingness to lie to medical professionals, manipulate legal proceedings, and steal hundreds of thousands of dollars from someone they claimed to love. So you felt that extreme measures were necessary. I felt that the only way to stop their conspiracy was to allow them to believe they had succeeded, while documenting their crimes in ways that would ensure their prosecution and conviction. Dr. Harrison nodded with understanding. And the 6 months you spent at Riverside were the most valuable 6 months of my life, I replied. I learned exactly who my family really was, and I gathered enough evidence to ensure that they would never be able to threaten my independence again. As I watched Dr. Harrison drive away from my restored home, I reflected on the journey that had brought me from a psychiatric hospital back to my rightful life. The experience had been painful and challenging, but it had also taught me lessons about family, loyalty, and justice that I would carry with me forever. My family had assumed that I was too trusting and naive to recognize their conspiracy, and too weak and incompetent to fight back when I discovered their betrayal. But they had fundamentally misunderstood who they were dealing with. I was not the confused and fragile woman they had portrayed to doctors and judges. I was someone who had inherited not just my grandmother's money, but also her intelligence, her patience, and her determination to protect herself from people who would take advantage of her generosity. The most expensive mistake my family ever made was underestimating the woman they thought they knew so well. And the most satisfying revenge I ever achieved was proving that their assumptions about my capabilities were completely wrong. For anyone watching this who has experienced betrayal by people who claim to love you, I want you to know that the truth always emerges eventually. The people who underestimate your strength and intelligence will eventually provide you with opportunities to prove exactly what you are capable of achieving. And sometimes, the best revenge against people who try to steal your life is simply living that life better than they ever imagined you could. If this story resonated with you, please like, subscribe, and share your experiences in the comments below. Remember that family loyalty should never require you to sacrifice your independence, your assets, or your fundamental rights as an adult. The greatest gift you can give yourself is the knowledge that you are stronger and smarter than the people who try to control you. And that no conspiracy, no matter how carefully planned, can succeed against someone who is willing to be patient, strategic, and absolutely ruthless in defending what belongs to them.